The snow had begun before dawn, thin and soft as sifted flour, settling on the roofs of Dry Creek like it was trying to hush the sins beneath. It drifted down the crooked chimney stacks, dusted the horse posts, blanketed the split rails, and hushed the dry grass till the world looked cleaner than it ever had a right to. At the far edge of town, where the prairie stretched like a held breath, a lone wagon sat unmoving, not tied, not guarded. Just left. Its canvas was sagging under the weight of snow, its wheels crusted in brown frost. One of the back flaps hung open, snapped loose in the wind, and through it, the morning light caught on pale linen and a shape too still to be asleep. Inside, she lay like a secret, a woman wrapped in a thin wedding dress and a coarse wool coat someone had likely thrown over her as an afterthought. 25 years old, and yet her eyes held the silence of someone twice her age. Her hands rested limp in her lap, fingers curled slightly as if they were always cold. She hadn't moved in hours. Not since the wagon had stopped, not since the men had unhitched the horses and walked away laughing, their boots crunching off into town. One of them had called it a gift. Another had said it'd be funny. A paralyzed bride, wedding lace and all, given to a man they thought too odd, too quiet, too simple, to know any better. But he did know better. He stood just a few paces away from the wagon, not speaking, not moving. The townsfolk had called him down that morning, slapped his shoulder, handed him the reins of a tired gray mare, and said, "You'll want to see what we got for you. Thought you might be lonely." He hadn't answered. Just followed. Now, as the others wandered back toward the saloon with whiskey on their breath and cruelty in their bellies, he remained. Hat low, coat long, shoulders broader than most but drawn like a man used to carrying things heavier than they seemed. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the powder. His hand reached up and gently peeled back the canvas flap. Their eyes met. Hers, wide and dark like wet soil, flicked upward to see him. Not fear, exactly. Not hope, either. Just watching. Like she'd learned long ago not to expect anything, and therefore couldn't be disappointed. He didn't speak. Didn't ask her name. Didn't comment on the way her legs hadn't shifted. He only bent down, arms careful and sure, and gathered her up like she were something sacred, not because she was fragile, but because she'd already been handled too roughly by too many hands. She was light. Not from grace but from hunger. Her head rested just beneath his jaw as he walked, slow, steady steps past the jeering men, past the preacher's stoop where no one came to protest, and down the narrow trail that led out of town. The sky grew heavier as they went. Clouds stacked thick over the trees, snow falling more surely now. The town faded behind them, and still neither spoke. She didn't cry. He didn't comfort. It was something quieter than either, a shared stillness that felt almost like reverence. His cabin came into view just as the sky turned the color of tarnished silver. It wasn't much. A slant-roof thing tucked between pine and alder, smoke curling faintly from the stone chimney, one shutter half broken, the door hung true but worn. Inside, it was warm, not from fire but from the way it was lived in. A cast iron stove flickered with embers. A table bore the scratches of a man who used it often. Hooks held coats, tools, a faded scarf. He didn't set her down right away. Instead, he carried her to a corner where a cot had been laid out, thickest quilt he owned, clean sheets, a pillow that still smelled faintly of pine soap. She looked at it, then at him. Something almost like disbelief passed through her features. And still, he didn't speak. He simply placed her there with care, shifting her so her back was supported, tucking the quilt to her waist like it were ceremony. Then he stepped back, pulled a log from the pile, and fed the fire. Outside, the storm built. Wind whispered against the window panes. Inside, she sat like a ghost learning to be human again. Her fingers brushed the fabric at her sides. Not testing her strength. She already knew the truth. She was paralyzed from the waist down. It wasn't new. But something about this cabin, this man, didn't press on that truth like others did. She watched him move, not quickly, but deliberately. Everything done with thought. He boiled water. Poured some in a chipped basin. Took a clean cloth, wet it, and brought it to her without a word. Held it out. She looked at the cloth, then at him. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it, and he didn't flinch when she dropped it. Just picked it up, pressed it gently to her cheeks himself, and then handed it over again. It was the first thing anyone had given her in weeks that wasn't pity. She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. Later, he ladled out stew from a small pot, root vegetables and beans, nothing fancy, but hot and full of care. Fed her slowly, giving her time. She ate only a little. When she coughed, he waited. When she sighed, he paused. And when she finally spoke, voice low, raw from silence, it wasn't her name or her story. It was just 3 words. "I'm still here." He met her gaze, nodded once. Then turned back to the fire. That night, she lay awake while the wind howled through the eaves. Her legs, unmoving, throbbed with phantom pain, old injury, old nerves that never quite understood the message. But her chest felt warmer. Her fingers had stopped shaking. The cabin was small, but it didn't feel like a cage. And the man, quiet as dusk, strong as earth, didn't feel like a jailer. He didn't ask what she'd done to be given away. He didn't ask how she'd fallen, or who had laughed. He simply let her be. As if that were enough. As if it were the beginning of something not yet named. In the final hours before sleep, she stared into the fire's glow and let her heart stop bracing for the next blow. For the first time in a long time, no one had asked her to prove she was worth the air she breathed. And though her body hadn't moved, something within her shifted, quiet as snow, slow as forgiveness. She closed her eyes. Not in fear. But in rest. And outside, under a sky thick with falling white, the wagon stood empty. Abandoned. Unneeded. Just like the joke they thought they were playing. But the joke didn't land. Because what they'd meant to humiliate had become, quietly, almost tenderly, the first step in something else entirely. And the man who was never meant to matter? He had just become someone's safe place. The fire burned on. The days that followed moved like slow water, quiet, persistent, carrying things unseen beneath their stillness. Time didn't announce itself in that cabin. It passed through routine, through the sun shifting along the plank floor, through the soft sound of steam rising from a chipped kettle at dawn. He rose early. Always before the sky had warmed. He moved without noise, slipping on boots, tightening the leather of his coat. Sometimes he left before she woke. Sometimes she opened her eyes just in time to catch the shape of him moving past the window, tall, steady, fading into the frostbitten light. He came back with chopped wood, or herbs hanging from his belt, or jars traded for grain. She didn't ask where he went. He didn't offer. But he always came back. And he always placed a mug of coffee by her side, dark and bitter but warm, with the quiet reverence of a man setting down an offering. At first, she barely drank it. Her hands trembled too much. Her fingers curled unevenly around the handle, and her pride always stung louder than her thirst. But each morning he left it there, as if it were a choice she was still allowed to make. And that, more than anything, steadied her. The chair arrived on the third day. Made from a splintered barrel, rough wheels salvaged from a broken cart, and leather straps softened with oil. It wasn't elegant. It squeaked when it turned. But it moved. He didn't explain it when he brought it in. Just wheeled it close, braced it with bricks to keep it still, then looked at her like she'd know what to do next. She didn't. Not then. But later, after the fire dimmed and he'd gone out to check the traps, she pressed her palms against the arms and lifted herself inch by shaking inch until she was in it. Her body screamed. Her shoulders flamed. But she sat upright, facing the hearth. When he returned, he said nothing. Just added wood to the flame and nodded once, as if the sight of her upright was not surprising, only expected. Evenings were the quietest. The cabin breathed softly after sundown. He cooked in silence, fed her gently, sometimes with his hands when she couldn't hold the spoon. She hated that at first, the way it made her feel like a child, but he never rushed her, never looked away. His eyes held no pity, only presence. That, in time, made it bearable. On the seventh morning, a woman from town knocked, preacher's wife, all wrapped in red wool and powdered disdain. She brought soup in a blue porcelain bowl and words shaped like prayers but bent like knives. "A poor thing, isn't she?" she said, standing over her like she was already buried. "God bless you for taking her in. I suppose everyone must carry a burden. This must be yours." He didn't answer. Just held the door open until the woman left, red cloak sweeping the snow. Later that night, he lit a second candle and set it beside the woman's cot. No sermon. No speech. Just a soft light glowing by her side as she watched the flame. And somehow, that gentle flicker spoke louder than all the words the preacher's wife had uttered. She began whispering stories to herself at night. Not out loud. Just inside. Memories she folded and unfolded like old linens, creases of who she used to be, who she was allowed to be, once. Before the fall. Before the stairs. Before the silence in her father-in-law's eyes when he decided she was no longer worth the cost of care. She had believed it, too. For a while. Until this cabin. Until this man who never said what he thought but always acted like she mattered anyway. By the end of the second week, she had made it to the door. It took her nearly an hour, inching the chair across the cabin, muscles burning, palms blistered raw from gripping the wheels. He watched her from the table, never moving to help, but not leaving either. Just letting her do it. Letting her try. When she reached the door, she couldn't open it. Her arms shook too hard. But he was already rising, already stepping forward, already pulling the latch back and holding the frame steady as she looked out. Outside, the snow had melted just enough to reveal the brown grass underneath. Birds were singing in short, sharp bursts. The wind was soft. She didn't cry. But she did breathe deeper than she had in weeks. And he stood beside her, not speaking, not smiling, just standing. Just sharing the view. That night, she said her second sentence. "It's not over, is it?" He turned his head, then slowly shook it. A long, slow no. In the quiet that followed, she felt something uncoil inside her. Not joy. Not yet. But space, for something new to root. He began carving things in the evenings. Bits of wood shaped into spoons, hooks, a handle for the hearth. And once, a bird. Small, with wings just beginning to stretch. He left it on the windowsill beside her bed. She touched it only once, but moved it later to the shelf beside her chair. She asked no questions. But her eyes began holding him longer. Her own voice came slower. Hesitant, like testing ice. A few words. Then more. And once, a laugh. Quiet, startled, like it had escaped without permission. It died quickly, but he looked up from his work and nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that sound. One afternoon, he brought in a length of rope and hung it from the beam near the bed. A grip to help her shift her weight. She tried it that same hour, and though her arms burned, she managed to swing from bed to chair without help. She cried after that, not from pain, but because it was the first thing she'd done without assistance since they'd loaded her into that wagon. He didn't come closer. Just stood near the stove, head bowed slightly like he was listening to something ancient and private. Winter began to shift toward something softer. Icicles wept from the eaves. The road outside the cabin became less a path through snow and more a path through thawed earth. And with that thaw, she began to ask things. "What's your name?" He answered. Just one word. Then returned to stirring the stew. She tried it aloud later, when he was gone. Just to feel how it sounded in her mouth. She told him hers the next night. He didn't repeat it. But the next time he made her tea, he etched the first letter of her name into the side of the cup. It was a strange thing, being seen without being spoken over. It made her ache in places that hadn't ached since before the fall. Some nights she couldn't sleep. The pain in her legs, phantom and cruel, would twist through her like wire. He would hear her breathing change and get up without a word. Brew herbs. Warm compresses. He never asked what it felt like. Just listen when she finally broke and told him, "It's like being burned by something that isn't there." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. And though he didn't say why, she believed him. And so, the days passed. Not fast, not slow. Just full. And then came the letter. Left on the porch, weighted with a rock. No sender. No kindness. Just a few lines scrawled on rough paper. "Heard you've taken in the broken girl. Maybe you'll fix her. Or maybe she'll break you too." She read it twice. Then again. He saw the letter, didn't read it. Just watched her eyes. She folded it, laid it in the fire herself. Watched it curl and blacken and vanish. When it was gone, she looked at him and said, "I'm not broken." He didn't correct her. Didn't comfort her. Just stepped closer, not touching, just being near. That night, the chair was moved closer to the window. Together, they watched the moon rise over the trees, casting silver over everything that had once been cruel. She didn't cry. He didn't speak. But something passed between them in the stillness, soft and wordless and real. And though no promises had been made, though no future had been named, they both understood something simple and enduring. This was not where her story ended. It was where it had finally begun. The first real thaw came in the third week, when the snow lost its voice and melted slow into the soil. Drips ran from the eaves like soft music, and the fields around the cabin turned from silver to mud. The air was still cold, but it carried something new, the scent of earth remembering how to breathe again. Inside, the cabin moved to a rhythm quieter than words. He worked as he always did, steady, precise. But now she spoke more. Small things at first, comments on the weather, questions about the birds she could hear outside the window. He never answered in long strings, but his eyes softened each time she asked. His silence was never empty. It listened. One morning, she tried to peel an apple by herself. The blade trembled in her hand, sliding too easily across the skin. She held it awkwardly, fingers stiff, palm sweating. He sat nearby, fixing the hinge on a cupboard door. Said nothing, but she knew he was watching. The silence between them grew heavy, as if the air held its breath. Then the knife slipped. She hissed softly, not in pain, but in frustration, and dropped it. A thin cut ran across her thumb. Not deep, but red enough to stain the edge of her sleeve. Before she could look up, he was already there. Not rushing, just moving with the same sure care he always did. He took her hand in both of his, calloused palms against her soft fingers, and pressed a clean cloth gently to the wound. She didn't meet his gaze. Her lips were tight. She wanted to say she could have handled it. Wanted to say she didn't need him fussing over her like she was made of glass. But before she could speak, he said softly, "You don't have to be useful to be worth loving." The words fell into her like warm rain into cracked soil. He didn't look at her as he said them. Just held her hand a moment longer, then turned away to rinse the cloth in the basin. But her eyes didn't leave him. That night, she lay in bed long after the fire had gone to embers, her hand resting quietly on her chest, thumb still aching from the cut. Not from the pain, but from the way his words had settled there. He'd said love. Not pity. Not service. Love. She didn't know what that meant between them, not yet. But she knew it wasn't casual. The next day, he told her a story. Not with pride, not with polish. Just one slow sentence after another while he chopped vegetables for stew. His wife had died years ago. In childbirth. The baby, too. He hadn't told anyone the name. Not even the preacher. But he told her. Just once, and then never again. As if saying it aloud let him let it go. She didn't speak for a long time after that. But that evening, when he passed her the bowl of stew, their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. And neither did he. A week later, he built a garden bed. Raised, waist-high, just outside the cabin window. He filled it with soil from the hills, with herbs and tiny seeds. She asked why. "You said you liked the smell of mint," he answered. She stared at the rough wooden box for a long time, fingers brushing the edge. No one had ever built something just for her before. Especially not something that didn't need to be made. He helped her out into the light. The wheels of her chair carved gentle arcs into the damp earth. She leaned close, dragging her fingers through the dark soil, letting it gather under her nails. For the first time since the fall, she felt the world respond to her again. It was a strange thing, feeling rooted without being able to walk. But there it was. Something like joy. Quiet, stubborn joy. They planted together. Basil. Thyme. Lavender. "Lavender's for courage," she murmured. He nodded. "Then we'll need plenty." By early spring, she had begun writing again. Not long letters, just small thoughts scratched onto old paper with charcoal from the stove. She left them folded near her bed. Sometimes she read them aloud when the nights were long. Sometimes he listened. Sometimes he didn't. But always, she kept writing. One afternoon, a child from a nearby ranch arrived on horseback, a boy no older than 10, blood on his sleeve and panic in his voice. His little brother had taken a bad fall. Couldn't walk. Couldn't breathe right. Parents were gone to town. They didn't know what to do. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He saddled his horse, grabbed supplies, and rode out without a word. Dust kicked up behind him as the cabin door swung shut. She waited. And waited. The night fell thick and moonless. The wind picked up. The fire cracked and hissed. Still, he did not return. When midnight came, she moved. Painfully, slowly, she rolled herself toward the hearth, dragging a fresh log from the stack. Her arms ached. Her spine throbbed. But she fed the fire. Adjusted the coals. Brewed tea with trembling hands and left the cup on the table beside his chair. By the time the sun began to lift over the far hills, the door creaked open. His silhouette filled the frame, exhausted, filthy, one sleeve torn, but his eyes met hers like a returning anchor. The boy had lived. Breathing, resting now. No thanks from the family, not yet. Just the relief of knowing he'd made it in time. He looked at the cup on the table. Steam long gone. But still there. "You waited," he said. She gave a soft, tired smile. "So did you." And that was when something changed. Not loudly. Not with fire or confession. Just in the way they moved around each other. In the glances that lingered longer. In the silences that didn't need filling. He carved her new handles for her chair. She cut herbs for his tea and tucked mint leaves into the folds of his coat. They never spoke of love. But it was there, in the details. In the way he stood behind her when strangers came. In the way she touched the carved bird on her shelf when he left for town. In the way they both, quietly and without announcement, began to expect each other's company like sun expects the sky. One night, he reached to hand her a plate, and their fingers touched again. But this time, she didn't let go. Not immediately. Not fully. He looked up, eyes uncertain, but not afraid. She held his gaze. Quiet. Steady. Then whispered, "You see me." It wasn't a question. He nodded once. And replied, "I always did." She didn't cry. But something inside her unraveled. Something tightly wound and long starved of air. He sat beside her, closer than before. They didn't touch again. Didn't need to. They just sat, listening to the fire, while outside the lavender began to bloom. And for the first time in her life, she felt like more than flesh. The lavender bloomed in late spring, soft purple sprigs rising from the raised bed outside the cabin, small but unyielding. She wheeled herself out to them every morning now, fingers trailing along the blossoms, the scent pressing into her skin like memory. Her hands were stronger. Her voice steadier. And her silence, when she chose it, was no longer rooted in fear but in self-possession. She was not the same woman who'd arrived in that wagon. She wore the same coat, the same woven shawl tucked around her waist, but now she looked at the sky like it was something she might one day reach. There were lines of pain in her face still, yes, but they had shifted, no longer the kind of pain that shrinks a person, but the kind that refines them. He watched her in the quiet ways he always had. Never hovering, never pressing. Just present. He built a low table beside her garden so she could mix herbs. Whittled her a new spoon with a curved handle for ease. Strengthened the wheels on her chair when she wasn't looking. They'd fallen into a rhythm that felt unspoken but known. Not lovers. Not just companions. Something quieter. Stronger. Something that didn't need naming to be real. And then, one morning, 3 riders came. Dust rose behind them like smoke as they rode up the trail. She saw them first, from the window, tall men with broad shoulders and long shadows, laughter curling from their mouths like smoke before a fire. They didn't knock. One called out from his saddle, loud and bright. "Well, I'll be damned. Look who's still kickin', da." Another leaned forward, tipping his hat with mock respect. "She's even upright now. Guess miracles happen when you hand a woman over to a man with no expectations." The third just spat into the grass and said, "Reckon we oughta take her back, eh? Seems she's got value after all." She didn't speak. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair, not with fear, but with restraint. He stepped out of the cabin then, jaw set, coat unbuttoned, eyes hard but not wild. The wind carried nothing but the sound of horses and old, hollow laughter. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't threaten. He just stepped down from the porch, the space between him and her as unbreakable as if he'd built a wall with his own hands. "She's not yours," he said, voice even. "Never was." The men shifted in their saddles. One snorted. "You married her, didn't you?" "No," he said. Another smirked. "Then she's still up for the taking." She spoke then, her voice low and clear. "I wasn't up for the taking the first time." All 3 men turned. She had wheeled herself out onto the porch, slow and steady. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, back straight, gaze sharp as glass. "You didn't give me away. You threw me out," she said. "That's not the same as ownership. It's cowardice." One of them laughed, but it faltered at the edges. "You don't sound so broken now." She tilted her head. "That's because I'm not." The cowboy didn't move, didn't smile. But he stood like a man beside something worth protecting, not because it was fragile, but because it was sacred. There was a long silence. The kind that tests men. And then, with a scoff, they turned their horses. No fight. No redemption. Just the smallness of men revealed in full when their cruelty no longer lands. When they disappeared down the ridge, she let out a breath. He stepped beside her, hand brushing the back of her chair. Not guiding, just being near. That night, neither spoke much. The fire burned low. The lavender in a jar on the table perfumed the room with calm defiance. But something had shifted again. The world outside had seen her. Heard her. And she hadn't broken. Word moved through town faster than wagons. Folks who had once whispered behind closed doors now leaned in with curiosity, and maybe, for some, a flicker of respect. A week later, during the first fair of the season, the preacher's wife invited her to attend. Not as a spectacle. As a guest. She almost didn't go. The idea of being watched again scraped against old wounds. But he didn't try to convince her. He just said, "If you go, they'll see what I've seen." She said yes the next morning. He built a ramp. Polished her wheels. Walked beside her the whole way to town without ever touching the chair. The townsfolk turned. Of course they did. But not all with cruelty. Some with surprise. Some with a strange, quiet pride. A few children smiled. At the edge of the square, a small platform had been set up for readings, mostly scripture, some local news. A teacher's son, no older than 7, stepped up holding a folded piece of paper. It was her letter. She had written it days before, then tucked it into the teacher's satchel with a nod. No signature. Just words. The boy read it aloud, slow and clear. Strength is not the same as walking. It is not loud. It is not always seen. Sometimes, it is choosing to stay. Sometimes, it is lifting others without standing. And sometimes, it is being left in a wagon and daring to believe you still have a name. The square held still. No one clapped. Not right away. Just silence, heavy, full, the kind that means someone's truth has landed. She didn't cry. But she looked over at him, and his eyes were already on her. Later, when they returned to the cabin, he didn't say a word. Just made tea, lit a candle, and placed a small wildflower beside her bowl. They didn't speak of love. But they didn't need to. That night, for the first time since winter, she dreamed without pain. And somewhere deep in her chest, something unfolded, not hope, not quite. Something older. Something like belonging. Spring gave way to early summer, soft and golden, the wind warm enough now to open the windows wide and let the scent of earth roll in. Wildflowers bloomed at the edge of the woods. The lavender bed outside the cabin stretched fuller than it had ever been, defiant in its color, and she with it. She no longer asked permission to do things. If she wanted to wheel out to the edge of the ridge, where the fields opened to the sky, she did. If she wanted to plant in the earth with dirt pressed deep beneath her fingernails, she did. And when she wanted to tell him a story from her childhood, about climbing a hill barefoot to pick apricots and bruising both her knees in the fall, she told it, voice soft but unashamed. He listened. He always had. But now there was something more in the way he did. Something leaning in. Something not just content to witness, but to join. That morning, she'd asked for her shawl. The one she'd worn in the wagon. The one still folded in the chest at the foot of the bed, smelling faintly of dust and cold. He'd brought it without question, and helped her drape it over her shoulders, his fingers grazing the back of her neck like a question unspoken. They were outside when the rider came. Single horse, galloping hard. She was shelling peas into a wooden bowl. He was setting a fence post deeper into the earth. Both looked up at once. The dust cloud told enough of the story. Urgency. Trouble. The horse skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing. The boy, not the same as before, but another rancher's son, barely caught his breath before he spoke. There's a fire. Lightning hit the north ridge. Jump to the low woods. We're trying to stop it, for it takes the east. My pa says anyone who can help should ride out now. The man didn't hesitate. His coat was on before the boy finished speaking. Rifle strapped, saddle cinched. He turned to her as he mounted. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked the one question neither of them had ever dared voice. Come back. He met her gaze, and though he said nothing, he nodded once. The promise was unspoken, but it was real. And then he rode off into the smoke-tinted wind. She watched the trail for a long time. Hours passed. The sun moved. The smell of fire grew stronger, wood and wind laced with ash. But the wind was in their favor. It blew west, away from the cabin. Still, dusk came heavy. Still, he did not return. She didn't wait helpless. She gathered water. Moved the dry kindling from near the cabin. Lit the lamps, 2 of them, in the window, the way her mother once had when her father stayed out late during floods. The night rose thick and dark. Orange glow flickered faintly on the horizon. Birds had gone quiet. And then, hoofbeats. She was outside before he even broke the clearing, her shawl flapping like wings behind her. He rode in hard, shirt torn at the sleeve, a dark streak of ash across his cheek. He dismounted slowly, breath ragged, arms trembling. But alive. She didn't think. Her hands reached before thought could catch up. She pulled him close, pressing her face against his chest, her chair wedged against his legs. He held her tightly, not out of strength, but out of need. His shoulders sagged, and she bore the weight gladly. They stood like that for a long time. No fire could reach them now. Later, inside the cabin, after she had wiped the soot from his brow and poured water down his throat, he rested on the floor beside her chair. One hand reached up and curled around hers. She squeezed it. I was afraid, she whispered. He looked up. His voice was hoarse. So was I. The words hovered there, trembling with everything they hadn't said. I didn't know what I was to you, she said. Not really. Until you left. And all I could think about was you not knowing. He sat up, face close now, closer than ever before. The firelight flickered gold across his eyes. Tell me, he said, softly. Now. She took a long breath, heart thudding like thunder in her chest. You are my proof that love doesn't pity. That kindness isn't weakness. That I'm not just something left behind to survive what other people couldn't carry. He swallowed hard. And you, he whispered. You made me more than a man who lives alone. You made me want to become someone gentle. Someone worthy of being trusted. Neither reached for the other. They didn't need to. The space between them was no longer space. It was understanding. It was everything they'd built in the slow, hard hours between silence and breath. I'm not broken, she said again. But this time, her voice didn't need defending. It was simply truth. I know, he said. You're stronger than anyone else I've ever known. And then he leaned forward, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a man who knew that every inch closer was sacred. He kissed her forehead, slow and reverent. She closed her eyes. When the fire burned low, they didn't sleep. They simply stayed beside each other, listening to the night exhale, to the wind hum through the trees, to the soft clatter of lavender stems brushing the windowsill. The next morning, they stood, she in her chair, he behind her, on the ridge behind the cabin. Below them, the fields stretched wide and green, wildflowers blooming in bursts of pink and yellow and blue. She pointed to a spot in the distance. "Someday, I want to build something there." He smiled. "What kind of something?" "A place for people like me," she said. "The ones the world tries to throw away." He said nothing for a long time. Then, "We will." "Not you." "We." She looked up at him. The man who'd been given her as a joke. The man who had never laughed, not once, at the wrongness of that cruelty. Only worked quietly to undo it. He had raised her, not with his hands, not with miracles, but with the slow, relentless tenderness of belief. Not just in who she was, but in who she could still become. She reached for his hand. Together, they looked out over the land. And the wind lifted her shawl like wings. They had been given ashes. But they had made something beautiful from it. Not perfect. But free. And higher than anyone else had ever dared imagine.